How are you? Welcome back. Bit of welcome relief from the desk today. I thought I'd go and have a look at how these forage rye crops are looking over the winter, and also one or two alternatives that have also been established to produce forage over the winter and into the spring. So come along with me and let's see how they're looking. So what we're going to look at today are three different situations. The first one would be what I'd refer to as my full fat rye crops. So this is forage rye, also established with some vetch in there as well, at the standard rate for the majority of cases where we're looking to produce a big catch crop over the winter. The second would be where we've actually halved the rate. I'll give the reasons as to why we've done that and some reference to what they did last year. But then also we'll look at a crop whereby we've got full fat rate, but also we've got some Italians in that crop just by chance. There's a bit of a comparison. So let's go and see how they're looking. So this is the first of the crops we're going to look at together today. An absolutely outstanding crop of forage rye and vetch at what I refer to as the full fat seed rate. That's not necessarily saying that we're over egging it, that there's too much seed being applied, but this has been established at that sweet spot that I've worked away over the last few years to find. Yes, there are different rhymes and reasons as to why you might want to change that, normally to get it slightly lower maybe. But for me, this is absolutely ideal. We'll see one or two other crops today that, with regards to their establishment, perhaps been a little bit unruly, a little bit too far forward. But this crop overall, considering that actually last year, this was the crop that received that 70 mil of rain after it was drilled, the same day it was harvested for maize, had some significant losses. But overall, this crop is absolutely incredible. So what is it for me that makes this crop incredible? As I say, it's this establishment, it's uniform, it's not too far forward, it's just at that perfect stage. The vetches have been able to establish really well, which we'll look at closer detail in a minute. In many cases, there are those situations where, for all the right reasons, we know that a lot of these crops were established a lot earlier than we would normally anticipate because of the type of year that we were given last year. Even seed was harvested earlier, so your forage rye seed was available for delivery, therefore drilling, sooner rather than later. But it is that situation whereby, for those perfect conditions that we've had almost over the autumn and into the winter, that some of these crops have gone that little bit too far, have become that little bit unruly, as I say. And that is something to bear in mind with regards to, if it is that you are looking to establish these crops and have them solely for a big cut at the end of April, beginning of May, they will need managing. They can get too far. You can actually create losses in a crop that you're looking to create volume from over the winter, just because they are a little bit too fit. So let's take a closer look at these vetches that have been established within this crop. As I say, they are there, they are getting away, and they're really starting to motor now as they're starting to reach for the light outside of the overall canopy. You'll see that they're starting to gain their tendrils. So these are the little spirally bits that literally they'll start climbing like any pea or a bean would do. And we need to remind ourselves the reason why we're establishing these vetches. Yes, they are there as a companion crop. They're going to be producing extra protein within the overall cut at the end of April, beginning of May. But of course, they're fixing nitrogen as we go, which will aid the following crop in this situation of maize once that's been established from a nutritional point of view. You'll be able to see behind me these tram lines that are now in the crop. They're not technically tram lines, they're just wheel marks more than anything, because these crops have now started to receive around about 30 kilos of N per acre. Not a massive amount, just enough to start feeding them now for, as I've discussed in the past, that incredible amount of growth that, not that they've done already an insignificant amount of growth, but especially what they're now going to put on between now and when we look to harvest these. Look, as I say, we're always aiming towards the end of April, beginning of May for these crops, but with the current conditions, if they continue, that may well be sooner. If it is that these crops progress, we've got the ground conditions to go, there's absolutely nothing stopping us going sooner if it is that the crop's there to be had and we can buy that extra bit of time. Now, just as a reminder, and possibly for some of those who may not seen my previous videos, what are we utilising forage rye or a conventional rye for over these winter months? Well, first of all, it's the environmental benefits, especially following the likes of maize. We're establishing a crop to give us that winter cover. We're ensuring that soils stay where they should be in your field. We're ensuring that nutrients aren't leached into watercourses. And of course, we're also keeping soil alive. As that maize crop is harvested, these are just literally direct drilled straight into the maize stubble. So that ground constantly has something growing in it, especially over those winter months, before it potentially goes back into maize again. From a forage point of view, we have potentially 5 months of the year where this sort of type of ground could easily, or has routinely in the past, led dormant. It's a significant opportunity for us to produce more forage within the rotation through part of a year that not everyone necessarily thinks about growing forage in. And that forage can be incredibly valuable, not only from a quality point of view, but also shouldering any shortages, as we saw last year with significant drought in a lot of areas of the UK. Now, when it comes to harvesting forage rye, as I say, usually towards the end of April, beginning of May, even though it's technically a cereal, we're going to be harvesting it just like grass. So we're going to be mowing it, tedding it out, rowing it back up, and then you can either bale it or chop it for silage, as to whatever fits your system best. But as per the videos that I did earlier on last year, I'll follow these crops with you all the way through. We'll keep an eye on them, we'll see how they perform at harvest time and just when that ends up playing out. But as I say, this crop is a first inspection into the new year, after it's had its bit of feed, looking absolutely tremendous. On to the next one. This is the second crop for us to walk today. Now, last year, this was a first time grower for Forage Rye and Vetch again. They grow maize rotationally on their farm and sell it as a standing crop. However, they wanted to have that winter cover, not necessarily focusing too much on the forage production side of it, but they did want to retain that soil nutrients and have that soil alive over the winter. Now, you've heard me discuss in the past that not all forage ryes are the same. There are some that should be reserved for cover crop reason only, those ones that are literally sacrificed into the new year, ploughed back in as a green manure. And we saw from those videos last year that compared to the full forage type forage rye varieties, that it just didn't have that get up and go necessarily. For this year, there is the opportunity and the demand, of course, to produce and supply forage from this crop that's produced over the winter. But again, from a price point of view, we discussed last year how when it is that you buy a mix that is ready mixed, the seed rates tend to be a lot lower compared to what we refer to as our full fat forage seed rates. So a compromise was had here. In actual fact, this is actually half the rate of the traditional rate that I would suggest, but the vetches stayed the same. So yes, we have had that happy medium, but we're actually achieving much more of a crop viable for forage production as well as that overwinter cover. Now, there's a lot of other elements at play this time last year. We'd just come out of the wettest winter on record, so yes, that will have had an impact as to how that crop had performed. At the moment, this crop is, for half the seed rate, looking tremendous. Possibly, you could argue, a little bit fitter and healthier for being that little bit thinner. It hasn't got sort of overwhelmed, it hasn't got over boisterous maybe and that too far forward. But hindsight is always a wonderful thing. As I say, we've had these brilliant conditions that we all needed to produce forage over the winter heading into this year after the year that we had last year. But overall, we do also need to bear in mind that if we'd halved the seed rate after last winter, this could look totally different. But ultimately, what are we looking at now? Overall, the crop is looking tremendous. Even from a vetch point of view, yes, the seed rate stayed the same for the vetch, but they've actually been able to establish possibly a little bit better for having that little less competition about them. They are fully accessed to the likes of light and they're getting away and growing really strongly. Like I say, we do need to bear in mind that yes, this has worked for this year, but it wouldn't have worked for last year. The losses that we saw in those full fat, full rate crops were significant in some cases. So if we halved the seed rate even more for those sorts of types of situations, our losses would have been even higher. But look, we'll live and learn, we'll take what we can gauge from this, and we'll see how they do compare with the different seed rates when it comes to harvest. But what I would also say is actually, from a grower's point of view, utilising the proper varieties, not those that should be left alone for cover crop only. They're actually a lot happier with the crop. Yes, we've had those better conditions over the winter as we've discussed, but ultimately this is what they wanted to achieve in the first instance. We've reflected on the choices that were made last year and the decisions that were put forward. We've tweaked those, we've amended them, not only to give a better outcome from a crop point of view, but ultimately fully meet the aims of what it is they intentionally wanted to grow and how to have their maize stubbles managed over the winter. Now, this next crop we're going to look at was never intended to be a specific trial, but it's just the way that it drilled out. The contractors at drilling time after maize was harvested have been planting some Italians with some of those vetches in, as we've looked previously, and they still had some in the drill. So one of the first laps around the field was the Italians with the vetch in, and the rest of the field was drilled with Forage Rye. For me, it's been really interesting actually looking at the differences so far this year and of course over the winter as to how they're working alongside each other, those differences between the two. You'll have remembered from my previous videos that if it is we're going to go down that grassroot option as a catch crop in between maize, I do much prefer the Italians, especially over the likes of Westerwolds. They do ultimately give you more options. You can keep them in longer if you wanted to, if a plan changes, but also that quality too. They also have a much better resilience and strength over the winter, a lot more robust, and giving you more opportunity of success within this period of the growing season. So let's have a look how they compare. So like I say, this never intended to be any form of trial or comparison, it's just the way it worked out. But I'm always really glad of when these sorts of types of things happen. And I would say for any of you at home, if you do have these things where you have these opportunities to have something side by side, keep an eye on them, see how they do compare throughout a growing season. It's always great to have them, as I say, literally side by side rather than separate fields to evaluate. Now, I appreciate that where the Italians were drilled in here, yes, it is more towards the headland, so you're always going to have that difference maybe. But actually, overall as a crop, the establishment has been really good regardless of where it is in the field, apart from some wet ends towards the end of the fields, and also there's a chute here on the farm, so quite a bit of bird damage possibly from the woods on the headland. But this was actually one of the crops, as there has been many. We discussed on the previous video about how especially these overwintered catch crops are looking in such good heart. They've gone in really good time, really good order, and raced away in terms of their establishment, which is brilliant, especially with regards to the amount of forage that we're still potentially requiring, almost as a nation, heading into this next year. Now, all that's great, but this type of crop in particular, even I've had my own little bit of reservations about and have been a bit twitchy. This is a prime example of the use of forage rye and how it can fit and that massive amount of forage that it can provide you. But all that bearing in mind, it has to be managed, especially around your establishment. We can't afford for these crops to potentially to be too far forward going into the winter and get that little bit unruly. These crops were starting to get that little bit unruly. We've actually had some losses of tillers in the base of the crop, which it is now starting to grow away from as we head into the spring. If it is that you are wanting to graze them in particular over the winter into the new year, that's fine. But if you're not, if you're looking for that big cut at the end of April, beginning of May, some of these crops, as I say, get a little bit out of hand. They can get messy and you can have some losses from just how far forward they can get. Now, I'm actually trying to keep myself away from the wind so that we're not getting too much wind noise on the microphone, but as you've seen in the crops that we've been around so far today, you can see that there's these tram lines in them. That extra bit of nutritional support has already been applied because of these drying conditions that we have had, in some cases really needed. Again, going back to those previous videos that I very first did in regards to forage rye, now is the time to really support those crops, that massive amount of growth potential that they have between now and the end of April. Yes, you can do nothing, you can leave them, they will give you a crop. but just that extra bit of a handhold, just a bit of a tickle of nitrogen will really support it for that massive kick of growth that you're wanting it to provide, and it's able to do over the next few weeks. Now, if we look at this crop in not necessarily the best part of the field, but what I would suggest is probably the most fairest part of the field for comparison, you can see those differences side by side. As I say, it's been almost fascinating to see how the two species have compared side by side over the winter. We will also progress and follow this all the way through till harvest, but actually you can see a lot more of the difference if it is that you get some altitude and we throw the drone up. Looking at it from these sorts of types of angles, you can see that actually from a lower level, grass will always look green, forage will always look green, but there is actually quite a stark contrast. They're two very different beasts side by side, but let's just take a little bit of a closer look maybe and just see how they're comparing on the ground. So here we have the strip of Italians looking really green, healthy, really fit, and really luscious to also include those vetches in there. Interestingly, as we switch over to the Forage Rye up alongside it, you'll see that just that little bit more open growth is actually allowing those vetches to progress, I think, a little bit better. But overall, absolutely tremendous crop, looking really well, looking really good and clean. But it is just how it compares at that final stage as we get to the end of April, beginning of May, before we go back to maize. This is now the Forage Rye. You can see it's a bigger beast individually. Yes, possibly not quite as thick, but it will make up for that significant yield for its overall tillering ability and height later on. But in particular, if it is that we're looking to make the most of these vetches, can you see how these vetches are really having that space to get up and progress and really quite a lot bigger? We'll follow this through all the way till harvest. I'll take you along with me. At the moment, both are looking incredibly well, but let's see how they compare towards the end of the season when it's D-Day for harvest. Now, the last stop for me today is to revisit those Italians and vetches from the previous video. We discussed whether it's the right or wrong idea to be grazing over the winter or front loading into the spring. I'm looking at them now, and since that last video, they look big. Now, as we said on that video, hindsight is always a wonderful thing. But what we do know is that, considering how wet it has been potentially this winter so far, we know how quickly it did dry up last year, and that massive requirement for forage that was needed throughout the year in a lot of parts of the UK. So as I say, whether it is the right decision or the wrong decision, we're yet to find out. But looking at this crop, I don't think we're going to be short of forage on a first cut necessarily. Now, even if we just use this wheeling that was left by the hedge cutter in the frost, always something to bear in mind, travelling across fields in frosty conditions over the winter cutting hedges can really damage your forages that are produced over the winter, or even long-term existing forage crops. But we can see that there is this significant growth. As I say, we've got a fair crop on here, even if I take you with me as I walk through it to give you some sort of an idea. We are really romping on with regards to overall yield from this crop. Now, of course, the actual acid test for crops such as these as to whether or not we've made the right call in these situations, of course, will come by the time we get to first cut on them. Whether or not they have held themselves together, whether or not they started going down. And of course, a lot of that depends on the weather that we get between now and then. But at the moment, as I said on that previous video, yes, we're drying up, but also we're keeping these winds, those breezy conditions that we have throughout any growing period, especially over the winter, actually really aid grass. Keeps them alive, keeps them on their feet, keeps the breeze blowing through them, and really minimises any potential for losses. But whilst we're here, let's just have a look at how the vetches are continuing within this crop of Italians. Now, compared to our last visit to this crop, you'll see that these vetches are actually a lot easier to find. They're getting their head above the overall canopy of the crop, they're fighting for light, and they're making their way now. Again, it's that nursery element of both species, forcing the vetch to really get up and grow to fight, but of course aids in its overall establishment and ultimately what it can provide with regards to the crop and the quality at the end of it. And of course, it's not to say that we will wait till traditional first cut times to take the best of these crops. If it is that the weather allows, the crop's there, and we don't want to risk it going too far forward and maximise the quality of what we've produced, that's where the calendar needs throwing out the window. We need to look at what we've got in front of us rather than traditional dates that we would normally work to in any given year for any given scenario. And of course, it should go without saying that have we applied nitrogen to this crop just to give it that bit of a feed as per the other crops we've seen today? Absolutely not. Again, breaking from that tradition of just routinely applying feed in the spring rather than working from the crop that's in front of you. If it is that we're to give a crop such as this any more feed, we definitely would be setting ourselves up for potential issues as we head between now and first cut. So there we have it. Bit of a brief rundown with regards to how some of these options are looking as we get into the spring. As I say, it'll be fascinating to see how they perform and also what Mother Nature hands us with regards to the weather between now and harvest time. But I'll follow you through with the progression of these crops, take you with me and see how they ultimately perform before we go back into lights of maize into April and May. As ever, if you've enjoyed, please like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye for now.